Hello, listeners. Welcome to another episode of the Blue Radio. Today, we will be hearing the story of a woman who has experienced physical, emotional, and neglect abuse during her childhood. Therefore, if these topics are sensitive or triggering for you, please listen with a trusted friend or professional. The survivor who will be talking for us today requested that her name will not be referred to in the notes I make during each episode. Therefore, for making things easier, I will use the pseudonym Isabelle for her. Let's hear her story. Isabelle is a successful and accomplished businesswoman, but she fails to recognize her accomplishments and agree with the ones who think highly of her. She also has problems trusting and forming close relationships.
As a kid, as far as I remember, I was neglected by my parents. And any time I tried to get them to pay attention to me, it ended up in contempt or being beaten up by one of my parents. They kept saying, "Be a good girl. You're not a good girl." I really tried so hard to be a good girl, but I really didn't know what do they mean by a good girl. After being beaten up for many times, being shouted at, and being punished, I figured a good girl is an invisible one. The one with no request, no noise, no need, nothing. I remember once we were coming back from a party, which to me lasted for 100 hours, as I was really trying so hard to be a good girl that night, a very good invisible girl. After the party, I sat in the car so excited that finally I could pull it together. And I was a good girl all night. I didn't make any of my usual mistakes. What was my usual mistakes, you think? I remember vividly. I shouldn't ask for anything to eat because my mom thought if a kid eats something in a party or asks for something to eat, it means the parents didn't give her anything to eat at home or they don't have enough food at home. So every time I wanted to accept a snack that I was offered to in a party, my mom shook her head. Doesn't matter that I was starving or not. And if I accepted behind her back, she became mad. Actually, she was always mad at me. Back to that night. After my parents got onto the car and my dad started driving, I naively asked my mom, Mom, was I a good girl? She didn't even look at me. She just shouted, "Shut up already." I was 6 that time. After billions of similar episodes, I ended up making the conclusion that I'm not their child. I was identifying myself with many cartoon characters that had wicked stepmoms. I made up the story that they found me and they gave me a shelter and they don't really love me because I'm not their real child. The conclusion alone made me feel so little and worthless. I was always quiet and invisible at school. I had no friend, and still I have difficulty to get close to people. I should tell you this. My parents are normal people. They're not alcoholic or drug addict. They are mentally stable. They're like any other couple you might see in the street. They laugh, they cry, they fight and kiss and make up. They chit-chat and enjoy life. They're not sick. There's no excuse for what they did to me. No matter how much I digged and looked for a little excuse to justify it, to forgive them, The only thing came as conclusion was that they shouldn't become parents because they are too selfish and arrogant for that. Yes, I am angry at them, and I never will forgive them. Not that it changed anything.
Isabelle faces difficulties in relationships with other people and with herself.
I am a middle aged woman, successful, strong in the eyes of many, hardworking, focused, goal oriented businesswoman to society, but to myself, I'm a nobody. What I see in me are all flaws. When it comes to love, I make the worst possible choices. I cannot trust anyone, and I don't believe anybody can really love me. When my potential partner tells me he loves me, the first thing comes to my mind is, what does he want? And I spend time to catch them in their lie. Don't get me wrong, I don't do these on purpose, and I have no idea that I am doing it. Even now that I spend so much time reading about how human mind and human psyche is working and analyzed my mind, I still, when I caught myself doing it, I cannot stop. I justify it. I figured I reject people who are the right choice for me and choose the one I know they fail me, all unconsciously. And that's why in the challenge of cutting them in their lies, I always win. You got me right. My biggest worry at this age, is ending up alone.
Isabel's childhood abuse led her to experience high levels of anger, and she has always been a harsh critic of herself. That caused her to strive for perfectionism and always work to the highest extent she can. Making friends has also been an issue for her.
For years and years, I had uncontrollable anger. I tolerated and tolerated and tolerated, and at some point, exploded. I was called, of course, by my parents crazy multiple times. I wasn't crazy. I was just sad and depressed. I was unable to communicate and tell them what is wrong with me or what I want. Later in my adulthood, I figured anger is one of the signs of depression in a child. I learned to control my anger during my adulthood, but it was really, really difficult for me. I'm a smart woman, and as a smart kid with zero self-esteem, during my teenage days, I decided to study hard to become successful. That made me a perfectionist, somebody that put herself under magnifier. I was the cruelest judge of me, no matter how much I achieved. I always felt empty in life. One of the worst impact of my abusive childhood is that I couldn't ever have a close friend or a lover. I always fill my days with work and other activities. I have limited capacity to be around people. I always am running away. I am trying so hard to overcome that, but something that comes naturally to people is so hard and energy consuming for me. I surrounded myself with layers and layers and layers of walls. A frightened, lonely little kid locked herself in an impenetrable castle. And it's really, really difficult for me to let anybody into that castle.
let's hear about how Isabelle stepped into the journey of healing. Her journey involved a lot of studying, learning, and understanding.
Healing is such a soothing word. For years and years, I didn't even know what was the problem. I thought I was the problem. I didn't know anything about abuse up to my mid-30s. That time, I had some extra time in my hand. And by extra time, I mean from 6 p.m. onward. As I was always looking for excuses not to have a life, I started studying psychology and fell in love with the subject. That was the start of my healing process. I better say, that was the start of my understanding process of who I am and why I do what I do. It helped me to start healing, but I don't know if I can ever heal completely. The scar is too deep and too old to go away. I'm not really in a position to give advice, but as a survivor, the only thing I could say to others like me is, don't let the scars define you. My advice, on the other hand, is for parents and the parents to be. Please, please, don't bring your child to this world when you're not ready. You are your child's whole world, everything. They look up to you. Please remember, your child is not evil. They are just kids. They want and crave your attention. They don't want to hurt you. They just need your love. You have to teach them. And if you don't know how, get help. Ask around. Read books. And always, always love them. And tell them that you love them, no matter what. Do not destroy another life just because you want to have kids for the sake of having kids.
As we can understand from Isabelle's words, an important part of the healing process is acknowledging. It's breaking the denial and accurately naming the experiences that you have gone through. At first, it must be difficult. Well, it is difficult to admit that you have suffered or undergone adverse experiences in a period of your life. The descriptions you might give of that event might be accompanied by rationalizations. A person who has experienced childhood abuse might say, well, I was a difficult child to raise. I was not very smart. I was not very hardworking. I didn't do in school. That made my parents angry. I exhibited certain behaviors that in that society made me deserving abuse. But no, nobody deserves abuse. And the context does not matter. No child should be abused. And that is important to remember. I have included a link with valuable information on this topic, and the notes I made on this topic just now were based on what I read in that source. Also, after realizing the trauma, it is important to feel. Children growing up in many households, not just abusive households, may have experienced invalidation of emotions, and they might have been taught to hide their emotions. This is also prevalent in many cultures. So, they will need to acknowledge and feel those feelings. I have included a link to an exercise that helps survivors acknowledge and feel their pain, eventually being able to set themselves free from it. The last step, setting oneself free, is very important. I'm emphasizing on this because after acknowledging childhood abuse and feeling the feelings, well, of course, every abuse has a perpetrator, and a large amount of that feeling might be resentment and anger towards that perpetrator. That is well expected. But this is not the goal of exercises that are for acknowledging and feeling. The goal is to know oneself better, to know the connections, the probable connections of the behavior one is showing as an adult, the problems they're facing, to the childhood abuse they have experienced, that of course is much more effective with the help of a therapist. But it's important to gain some insight into it. After listening to a number of stories, I will note that, well, as many of you might have understood, childhood abuse shows itself in adulthood in many different ways. Some people connect their adulthood perfectionism or being a harsh critic of themselves to their childhood abuse. Some people have experienced self-harm, and some people are afraid of making mistakes. So this is once again one of the evidences that childhood abuse does not always show itself the same way in adulthood, and we can't make generalizations. With that, I will end this episode. Thank you for listening.